Welcome to Language Brief, where we trace the cultural and political history of languages from all over the world. In this episode of Language Brief, I'll talk about the birth of the modern Japanese language, its complex cultural and political history, and some of the individuals who left a mark on the development of modern Japanese. This is part one of a two-part episode. Part two, which explores the rebirth of the Japanese language after World War II, will be available soon. Alright, let's get started. Maijima Hisoka, a lowly farmer from Niigata in the hinterlands of Japan, moved to Tokyo, then Edo, to work for the Tokugawa shogunate at Kaiseijo, which was to become Tokyo University, the first modern institution of higher education in Japan. In 1866, he petitioned the shogun, the de facto ruler of Japan, to simplify the Japanese writing system, which he believed was too time-consuming to learn and too complex for the average person to use effectively. Though his petition didn't immediately lead to any significant changes to the Japanese language, it sparked an intellectual movement in late 19th century Japan among Japanese and foreign scholars, the Genbun Ichi movement. Maijima would play a crucial role in language policy formulation throughout his life, and would also go on to found the Japanese Postal Service, where he would make such a profound contribution that he was made a baron, and his picture was featured on many Japanese postal stamps during the first half of the 20th century. He also published the Hiragana newspaper, a newspaper that used simplified and highly accessible Japanese in the 1870s. Imagine a world in which written language does not fully represent and reflect the language you speak. For instance, you're prohibited from writing words like ask, but have to use words like beseech and implore instead. That was the case with most of written Japanese during the 19th century. Intellectuals noticed this flaw and tried to correct it by proposing reforms to written Japanese. However, while they, with the help of the Japanese government, were successful in eventually turning written Japanese into a phonetic approximation of spoken Japanese, they ran into significant obstacles when dealing with the problem of kanji, or Chinese characters. Intellectuals and academics, including Maijima Hisoka, noticed that written Japanese still had several flaws. Firstly, it contained too many complex Chinese characters, or kanji, which made it difficult to teach and learn. Maijima would famously argue that limiting kanji usage would do little to solve the problem, likening the issue to asking the rich to spend less money. A language like Japanese, with a rich and varied literary heritage, would struggle to use fewer kanji unless kanji were fully abolished. Secondly, the Japanese language required individuals to mix a variety of scripts, syllabic and character-based, to write a sentence. Imagine when trying to convey a written message, you have to write a sentence using 3 or more different scripts. This was cognitively taxing. These were the problems that Japanese faced. Many of Japan's brightest thinkers dedicated their entire lives to addressing language problems like these, but to no avail. The problem of a multi-script writing system would come to haunt many Japanese businesses and scientists in the post-war period, as computers and computing technologies could not process or produce mixed-script Japanese until the late 1970s at the earliest, after decades of research and development. Wars between Japan and China, in addition to the Russo-Japanese War, the first time an Asian country defeated a so-called Western power, sparked a surge of patriotism across the Japanese archipelago. Many Japanese were told to be proud of their military strength, their ability to adopt foreign technologies and ideas without losing their national identity. At approximately the same time, a young graduate at Tokyo University, Ueda Kazutoshi, a student of one of the most active members of the Genbun Ichi movement of the late 19th century, Basil Chamberlain, started writing about the need to create a national language for Japan, a language that would unify the Japanese people along ethnic and spiritual lines. He wrote entire books about the need to cultivate a national language, which were extremely successful and highly influential, not surprising given the political climate in the early 1900s. The spread of academic publications about a national language marked the birth of linguistic nationalism in Japan, and it spread like wildfire. Since the 1870s, the Japanese authorities had actively spread the borders of the Japanese archipelago. As the borders of the Japanese nation began to expand, teachers were actively encouraged and, of course, took pride in spreading this nascent Japanese language all over the country. While the majority of Japanese welcomed this, on the peripheries, where indigenous culture was strong, there was opposition to the eradication of local linguistic heritage. For instance, in Hokkaido and Okinawa, recently acquired territories that had their own cultural, ethnic, and political identities, the introduction of a so-called national language and culture was slow to take hold. Teachers played an active role in rectifying the incorrect and provincial language used by children in schools in Okinawa and Hokkaido. They did this by punishing students who used their mother tongue in the classroom. And punishment took many forms. In many cases, it involved being forced to wear a dialect tag, a mark of shame, similar to a dunce cap, that was worn around a student's neck for an entire day. Needless to say, many students stopped using their mother tongue in the classroom, and this led to the decline of local languages and dialects. The linguistic diversity of Japan declined, and Japanese society continues to pay the price as many regional languages, including Ainu and the languages of Okinawa, are either threatened or close to extinction. As the national language spread to the remotest parts of Japan proper, Japan began to acquire its first colonial possessions, and by the 1920s it had established itself as a colonial power, on par with many European colonial powers. The Japanese Empire had annexed the Korean peninsula. It also occupied Taiwan, or Formosa as it was then known, and was eyeing China, and would eventually create a puppet state in Manchuria. To administer and govern its colonial possessions, it needed to establish the supremacy of the Japanese language in the region. And the Japanese authorities did this in numerous ways, by establishing a Japanese bureaucracy, Japanese language education, and the spread of Japanese customs and culture in the colonies. In the Japanese Empire, it was commonly acknowledged that colonial subjects hoping to climb the bureaucratic ranks needed to at least have a grasp of spoken Japanese, and ideally be well versed in written Japanese as well. Many mainland Japanese academics and intellectuals living overseas, in the colonies, supported the spread of Japanese to the colonies. And some argued for the spread of Japanese language schools, and in some cases a reduction in the importance placed on teaching local and home languages. Some even argued for the eradication of ethnic discrimination between Japanese and colonial subjects, and believed that the cultural and linguistic unification of Japan and its colonies was achievable in the not-too-distant future. As the Second World War drew closer, well-known linguists such as Tokieda Motoki, a professor at Keijo University, now Seoul National University, in colonial Korea, argued for even more extreme measures to help speed up the spread of Japanese. Mothers should only speak to their children in Japanese, and Korean as a language should essentially be banned from the household. Tokieda, a staunch conservative and nationalist, would go on to contribute to language policy formulation after the end of World War II. His contributions to linguistics, however, are also notable. as he was among the first to develop a contextual theory of language usage, perhaps inspired by his observations as a professor in colonial Korea. When the Second World War began, the military started to seriously consider the limitations of a mixed script writing system. Within the upper ranks of the Japanese military, some wondered whether the complex nature of written Japanese was hindering communication between units and between troops on the ground and military headquarters in Japan. Set lists of kanji were created to help limit the number of kanji in use, but just as Maejima had predicted in 1866, a simple limit on Chinese character usage was not enough to address the issue. The question of written Japanese as an obstacle to effective communication would resurface in the immediate aftermath of World War II, with the outlandish suggestion by Shiga Naoya, the most famous Japanese novelist at the time, that the Japanese language should be scrapped and replaced with French as the official national language of Japan. This suggestion was met by near total shock by the Japanese population, but with defeat in World War II, the stage had been set for a complete reappraisal of modern Japanese in both its written and spoken forms. In the next episode of Language Brief, we will explore the way in which the Japanese language developed after devastating defeat in World War II. We'll ask questions like, how was language used to democratize Japanese society? What role did the American occupation play in reshaping the Japanese language? What is the relationship between consumerism and language in Japan? These and even more questions will be answered in episode 2 of The Birth of the Modern Japanese Language.